We're very privileged to welcome Dr. Anthea Jeffery with us this morning, or this afternoon rather. She is the Institute of Race Relations Head of Policy Research, and she holds law degrees from the University of the Witwatersrand, Cambridge, and London University. I regard her not only as one of the best political analysts in South Africa, but also as a fearless historian of current events in South Africa. She has publications to her credit, such as BEE, Helping or Hurting, and then also People's War, New Light on the Struggle for South Africa, which are both publications that we recommend most strongly. But why we are having this talk this morning is about the Basic Education Laws Amendment Bill. I read an article by her on Biznews. It was published on Biznews on the 21st of April 2022, with the interesting heading, Lesufi's Revenge for his Overvaal defeat. So Anthea, welcome to our talk this morning, and thank you for joining us. And then first question, why is this the heading of your article on Biznews?
Thank you, Alana, and thank you for those words of welcome. It's because I think that the bill that we confront, this, the Bella Amendment Bill, as you were saying, is indeed everything that Panyaza Lesufi, the MEC for Education in Gauteng, requires in order to overcome the defeat he suffered over the Overvaal school and make sure that he can never be defeated again. So perhaps I should just explain what happened at Overvaal so that people have an understanding of that if they've forgotten over the years. It began in December 2017 when Lesufi's officials from the Gauteng Provincial Education Department informed the school, which is an Afrikaans medium school in the Verskyn area, that it must admit as of January 2018, so there was very little notice, 55 learners who were all English speaking, and it would have to provide education in English for these pupils. To which the school said, well, we simply can't, we're Afrikaans medium, we can't change so quickly. And the department's response was that it had provided a English teacher, hardly enough for pupils learning in different subjects in high school, that it had provided some furniture and some learning materials, and they recommended that some of the school's laboratories could be turned over to the classrooms. The school objected, particularly because it argued that there were English-speaking schools in the area which could accommodate these pupils, and the principals were happy to do so. When the matter came to court, it transpired that pressure had been put on the principals of these two English-speaking schools, and they indicated, I think it was in a phone call to the principal of Overvaal, that they were now under considerable pressure because they'd been given to understand that unless they said they couldn't accommodate these pupils, they might be dismissed, their pension rights would be at risk. So they were in a quandary. But all of this was now put before the judge, who didn't make any specific findings about undue pressure on those principals, but he did grant the school's application, so they didn't have to admit those pupils at all. And he made an order for punitive costs against Lesufi's department. So it was a way of signaling the court's displeasure at what Judge Bill Prinsloo obviously thought was unreasonable behavior, went against the Promotion of Administrative Justice Act in many ways. And his displeasure was evident in the punitive costs order. But what we have now with the Bella Amendment Bill is a rule which enables the head of department at Gauteng to decide that a school should change its language policy, that if it's a single medium school, it should perhaps become a dual medium school, and it should be able to offer any one or more of South Africa's official languages. And there is now some provision for consultation, particularly if there's to be a change from single medium to dual medium, Afrikaans to English, or both Afrikaans and English having to be provided. There must be consultation with the school itself, with parents, with pupils, but also with the community. And at the end of that, a decision will be made by the Gauteng department. And if the school wishes to object, it has a right to appeal to the MEC, who is, of course, Lesufi in the Gauteng area. And that seems to me an astonishing ouster of the jurisdiction of the courts. I'm aware that in the Schools Act at the moment, there are also provisions for appeal to the MEC rather than to the courts. If that's never been challenged, then I think it's time to do so, because the Bill of Rights also gives us all the right of access to the courts or an independent tribunal, not merely, of course, to an administrative official or an MEC. So that's one of the ways in which the Bella Amendment Bill could have very serious consequences for the rather few Afrikaans-only medium schools that there are in the country. One suspects that this may be what Lesufi and other MECs have particularly in mind. So I had a look at the statistics, and the ones that we have at the IRR indicate that there are now about 23,000 schools in the country, of which roughly 1,200 are Afrikaans medium only, and roughly another 1,200 teaching both English and Afrikaans. So it's really hard to imagine how an insistence on changing the medium of instruction at a small number of schools can have a major impact on the huge problems that our overall education system has, because we spend a great deal of money, but we get very little bang for the taxpayers' buck. There are other aspects of the Bella Bill which need perhaps to be mentioned. One is that the admission policy of a school, as set by its school governing body, must be sent to the Provincial Education Department for approval, that effectively the school governing body can be instructed to make changes. And in addition, the Provincial Education Department will be able to override the decision of a school governing body and its principle as to whether particular pupils should be admitted or not. And again, appeal will lie, according to the bill, to the MEC for education in each province.
Do you regard most MECs in South Africa, and I'm talking now in general, not only about education, are they usually experts in their field who come through a long administrative process and then are appointed, or do they tend to be political appointments?
I think that so long as the ANC has been in power, there's been an emphasis on political appointments. The ANC, as I think many of us know, has a cadre deployment policy, and that policy has thrown up many problems over many years, because very often, as even human rights, the HSRC has recognized, cadres are appointed for their loyalties to the ruling party, not necessarily for their experience or their knowledge. And it's very difficult also to hold cadres accountable in general, because they will be responsible not so much to their boss in the hierarchy of government, but rather to the deployment committee which put them in their particular position. And so this is another of the factors which undermines the performance of deployed cadres, because they can't be held to account in the way that they should be. Just as a general point too, when I look at the cases which have been decided by the Constitutional Court on school admission decisions, very often what the court has said is two main things: that the power to decide on admissions and on language policy rests primarily with school governing bodies. It can be overridden by provincial education departments, but then they have to act reasonably and they have to apply procedural justice. And in the three cases which have gone to the Constitutional Court, it's very clear that education officials did not comply with the need for reasonableness and procedural justice. But it was also emphasized by the courts that there isn't a complete power of the school governing bodies to decide these things. They do decide within the context of the Constitution, the Schools Act, provincial laws. But the requirements of reasonableness and procedural fairness are important. And so far, the courts have made sure that they are upheld.
Something which I find quite interesting, but that many people don't know, is that after the defeat of Overvaal, Lesufi approached the Constitutional Court for permission to appeal against the ruling, and he was denied permission. So, in effect, the Constitutional Court, even upheld the decision of Judge Prinsloo. But now it seems that first of all with provincial legislation, and now with efforts to promote the Bella Bill, Lesufi is trying to create new legislation that will not allow the Constitutional Court to do so. I think the South African Schools Act initially provided for school governing bodies to create a kind of a unique partnership between communities and the state. And now with the Bella Bill, we see that this partnership is being dissolved and that the power is finally returned to the state. Do you see the same kind of process in other areas in South Africa at the moment?
Yes, I think one can, for example, think of the National Health Insurance Bill. Perhaps the parallel is not complete, but certainly what we're going to see if that bill becomes law is that the government will take control of private healthcare, that all healthcare in the country will be as directed by the state, which will be able to control the price, which may be charged for medicines and medical devices and all of the equipment needed in healthcare. Will also be able to basically set the fees of doctors and specialists and nurses, even in the private sector, and will be able to implement controls of the treatment protocols, what the benefits should be that are available to people, and so on. So I think there is a tendency in the government. It has an interest in expanding state control. The health sphere is now a particular example. The education sphere, I think, is too. I think there has been a sort of gradual erosion of the powers of school governing bodies, and the Bella Amendment Bill reflects that. It will be harder to challenge decisions by provincial education officials. But on the other hand, the Bella Bill does lay down very clear requirements for consultation. If those consultation requirements are not adequately met, and they have in all these instances I've talked about, been a sort of impatience on the part of provincial officials. They've just rushed ahead and made the decision that they want and tried to force it on the school. If they do that in the face of the consultation provisions in the Bella Amendment Bill, then again, there is a cause of action which can be used. But I think the bigger question to really focus the government's attention on is, if the aim is to improve education in South Africa, which it surely should be, then there is so much more that needs to be done than to change the admission policies and the language policies of a relatively small number of schools. Again, I was looking at the figures this year in 2022, we're budgeting to spend 6.7% of GDP on education as a whole, including higher education. That's higher than just about any other country in the world. I think Denmark is the only one that exceeds us at 7.8%. So this is a vast allocation of resources, and yet our results are so poor that we have the real matric pass rate is something like 48% in 2021, because all the rest of the pupils fell out of school, either without passing their matric or without even trying to write their matric. And among the number of pupils able to obtain 50% for maths was limited to about 60,000 in all, or 5% of the total that enrolled for grade 1 12 years earlier. Those are where the problems really lie. And it seems that if we're trying to improve education in South Africa, that should be our focus. What can be done to help the schools which are dysfunctional, the schools where teachers often don't complete the syllabus, where children are not being adequately taught to read or to be able to do even simple arithmetic? That's where our focus must lie.
Yes, we always hear the very discouraging statistics about 80% of the schools being dysfunctional. We see the pearls and the TIMS and the other measurement statistics about South Africa really being at the bottom of all ladders and at the bottom rung. When we talk about improving schools and improving education in South Africa, what do you think that the union's role should be like, and to what degree do you ascribe the problems to their involvement?
Mm. I think that the involvement of a particular union, SATU, is definitely problematic. I expect many of us are familiar with the stories that came out a while ago, a report that was produced at government behest, which indicated that SATU had enormous control over 6 of the 9 provincial departments. And there seemed to be some evidence that SATU was involved in the selling of principal posts and so on. If that is so, and we didn't get conclusive proof of it, then it's a particular problem. But I think beyond that, what we have in South Africa is the same in a way as the problems in many other countries. Free public schooling, but it doesn't work well for the great majority of pupils. And what we're seeing in other countries, and it's been particularly documented by a man called James Tooley, is that there's a shift in very many countries, often in the poorest countries in the world, and Nigeria, and people living in informal settlements, Kenya, people living in informal settlements, they are jettisoning the absolutely poorly functioning state schools, which are free, for low-fee independent schools, where the principals feel that they answer to the parents, not to the education hierarchy of officials, where any teacher who doesn't teach properly will not last long in the school, because this principal has strong control and a sense of accountability to parents and pupils. And the results are very much better than they are in the free public schools. And this is a shift that we could facilitate in South Africa if we were willing to go the route of, say, education vouchers, which have been used now in a number of countries, where part of the education budget is in fact allocated to households, so as to empower them to choose the schools that they want their children to go to. And so that schools have to start competing for the custom of parents, rather than simply seeing pupils in their catchment area as people who have very little alternative choice and must just come and cope with whatever quality or lack of quality of schooling is provided.
We often visit schools, and as soon as you enter the schoolyard, it's evident whether the parents and the community are involved, or whether it's simply a school run by teachers and the principal. So we always say that where you have this wonderful partnership between the community, the school governing body, the teachers, the pupils, you have a school that is a winning school. And I think that is what is often lacking, because as you say, in many of the schools, the parents have very limited power to hold the teachers accountable. We were involved with a school in Eldorado Park recently, where some of the SATU teachers for years have been refusing to teach, and the department doesn't hold them accountable, and yet the department wants to centralize more power in its hands. So it's a very contradictory process. We focus at AfriForum quite specifically on the detrimental effects that the Bella Bill might have for Afrikaans schools. But in what way do you think it will also be detrimental for English schools or any other schools in South Africa?
I think it's the principle of sensibility you talked about that's an issue here. That obviously there needs to be a strong link between parents and the school and the community in which the school is situated. And decentralization is enormously important. You need people who have a clear interest in the welfare of a particular school and its pupils to have a powerful say in what happens there. And the more the government takes power to itself, particularly when it's a government which is ineffective and we fear often uncaring after things like the Wysigingswetsontwerp debacle, one fears that the best interests of the children will be less well looked after than an environment where the parents and the school governing body and the principal and the community are working closely together.
You've already referred to the National Health Bill, and here we have the Bella Bill, and there are many other similar bills. When the public sees any amendments or any bills of this nature, what is the course that you would recommend them to take? Do they just have to feel despondent and sit back and wait to see what is happening, or what role can an ordinary member of the public play to oppose legislation like this?
I think it's terribly important that written submissions should go in. On the Bela bill, there is still an opportunity to make written submissions. The deadline is next Wednesday, the 15th of June at 4 p.m, so people must not be late about doing it. Because the more people raise their voices against legislation, which has very negative downsides and which ignores the real changes that need to be made, the better. The more chance there is that the government will heed it. I've long been convinced that the ANC is involved in a national democratic revolution in South Africa, and that involves looking at the balance of forces from moment to moment. And if there seems to be no resistance to a particular policy, well, then it's easy to push forward with it. If you get a strong pushback, if hundreds of thousands of people put in written submissions, that is much more difficult for the government to ignore. And people maybe feel insecure about writing a written submission, but that's where I think organizations like yourselves, like the IRR, can make a difference, because we can put out a sort of model submission that people can then embrace. If it expresses their views, they can embrace it and send it in as their own submission, but without necessarily having to know all the sort of ins and outs of how you do a written submission to Parliament. I think petitions are also very helpful, that if there are a great number of signatories to a petition which argues against a particular change by legislation, that again is something of an obstacle for the ANC to consider. We know too that the Constitution does oblige the government to provide for adequate public participation in the legislative process. They must show that there was scope for individuals to know about the issues and to have their say. And there are certain bills which have been set aside for a lack of public participation. But the best way to make sure that the ANC can't just steamroll things is to use the public submission process that's made available, and for as many people as possible to raise their voices, make their objections known, and use the help that's available from organizations such as AfriForum, such as the IRL.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate that you joined us today, and I hope the public will take your advice to heart and will submit their objections to this bill, but also to other similar bills which might be very detrimental to us in future. We thank you for your time, and we wish you a wonderful day.
Thank you very much, Alana, and to you too.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.